So welcome back to Monitoring Clinical Trials. My name is Steve Pope, and this week we're going to be talking about protocol deviations. So let's start by looking at ICH E6 R2 section 4.5. So for our purpose, the investigator may implement a deviation from or change in the protocol to eliminate an immediate hazard to trial subjects without prior IRB approval. Now, as soon as possible, the implemented deviation or change, the reasons for it, and if appropriate, the proposed protocol amendment should be submitted to A, the IRB for review and approval, the sponsor for agreement if required, and to regulatory authorities. Now, most of you in a monitoring situation, and we're going to go over this in a little more detail as we move along, you're going to experience deviations that are, fairly routine, fairly minor. Some of them are going to require that the site submit them to the IRB. In many cases, they may not, and we'll go over that in a little more detail. But this is kind of like the regulatory definition of a protocol deviation, so I want you to be familiar with it as we move along. So for our learning objectives for this week, we're going to describe protocol deviations and serious protocol deviations, sometimes referred to as violations. We're going to cite the reporting requirements involving protocol deviations. We're going to discuss the PI's responsibilities according to ICH and FDA regarding protocol deviations and how they should handle them. And then finally, we're going to discuss the role of sponsors and monitors in the identification and assessment of protocol deviations. So before we get started, it's important to understand that FDA and ICH offer little guidance on protocol deviation that's up for interpretation by sponsors and IRBs. So in other words, sponsors and IRBs basically create their own guidelines for what is a deviation, what should be reported as a deviation, what should be how a deviation should be handled, how it should be monitored. And so deviations are basically associated with protocol noncompliance. And because every protocol is different, then you're going to have a different set of possible or potential deviations. So we're going to go over these in a little more detail as we move along. So let's talk about protocol deviations versus serious protocol deviations. So protocol deviations can be minor. They can be, and I'll cite you some examples in a little while. But most of the ones that you're going to encounter are going to be fairly minor and fairly routine. Now, serious protocol deviations can also be called important protocol deviations, or they may be called protocol violations, indicating that they're more severe. So we're going to show you some examples of what these are, as we move along. So let's look at a definition of a protocol deviation. So it can be an accidental or unintentional change to or noncompliance with the research protocol that does not increase risk or decrease benefit or does not have a significant effect on the subject's rights, safety, or welfare, or the integrity of the data. So deviations may result from the action of a subject. It could be the action of somebody at the site staff, the researcher or the research staff. It could be the PI, it could be a coordinator. It could be someone in a lab, could be someone in a pharmacy. And a deviation may be due to the research subject's non-adherence or an unintentional change to or noncompliance with the research protocol on the part of the researcher. So it's important to understand that a deviation can occur from anyone associated with the trial. For example, it could be the result of a rescheduled study visit, and the visit becomes what we call out of window, so it's not on the same schedule as it should be. It could be the failure to collect an ancillary self-reported questionnaire. You have a lot of these in a clinical trial, and maybe the subject, failed to bring it back, or maybe the coordinator did not review it or didn't make a copy of it and place it in the subject source. That could be a deviation. It could also be the subject's refusal to complete scheduled research activities. Maybe they just didn't show up for their visit. They missed their visit. That happens. And it could be a legitimate reason why they didn't miss it, or it could be a really arcane reason why they didn't miss it. But the fact that they didn't show up for the visit and the visit wasn't conducted, that would be a deviation. So these are just some samples of what protocol deviations are. So a serious protocol deviation or a violation would be an accidental or an unintentional change to or noncompliance with the IRB approved protocol without prior sponsor or IRB approval. So violations are generally going to involve increased risk or decreased benefit, and they may affect the subject's rights, safety, or welfare. Some examples of these would be failure to obtain a valid informed consent. For example, the obtained informed consent with a non-date stamp form. In other words, they used the wrong consent form to consent the subject, so the subject was never properly consented into the study. That could be a serious protocol deviation. It could be the loss of a laptop computer that contained identifiable private information about subjects. It might be an accidental distribution of incorrect study medication, maybe a dosing error. That could be a serious protocol deviation because that could be a safety risk. And it could be not following the inclusion-exclusion criteria. That might be a serious protocol deviation or violation. So these are examples of what we mean. You can see they're more severe, they're more important, they have a greater impact on the safety of a subject and the integrity of our trial. So we want to cite the reporting requirements involving protocol deviations. So when you're monitoring out at your sites, you're going to discover deviations and you're going to record them either in your trip report or maybe in your CTMS system, however your sponsor or CRO wants you to do that. The other thing that you're going to do is you're going to determine what the reporting requirements are for that specific deviation. So protocol deviations should be reported to the IRB according to the IRB's reporting requirements. So it's important to understand what those requirements are. Many IRBs only want deviations reported that are related to the study drug or are major safety impact, for example. So they'll publish documents, they'll publish guidelines that explain what their requirements are. So you need to be aware of those and need to be familiar with them. Protocol deviations should be documented in detail by the staff. Most sites are going to have a protocol deviation form or some form of documentation that they use to explain what happened, who was responsible, the dates it occurred, what the impact was, what the resolution was, and whether or not it was reported to the IRB or the sponsor in some cases. You also want to, deviations should be pointed out to the monitor during monitoring visits, and they should be recorded on a deviation log. So sometimes they do that, and sometimes they don't. Some sites have deviation logs that they keep track of these things, others don't. Sometimes you're going to discover these deviations as you're performing your monitoring tasks, and you're going to bring those up to the coordinator or the PI, depending on what the complexity of it is. But just bear in mind, some sites are going to have deviation logs and some aren't. And then finally, protocol deviations should be discussed with the site staff, including any corrective or preventative action. So you want to talk about these with the coordinators. You want to talk about it with the PI. In most cases, they're going to be just small ancillary things, and the site is going to promise to do better next time, and they won't make that mistake again. And you're going to document that in your trip report. But it's important that you accumulate those, because as you're going through multiple monitoring visits, if you start seeing the same deviation over and over again, that can be indicative of a trend, and then you might have to implement some type of corrective action or some type of CAPA program. So it's important to document these as you're going along. So let's take a look at the reporting requirements. ICH E6 section 3.3.8 indicates that specifying that the investigator should promptly report to the IRB any deviation from or changes of the protocol to eliminate immediate hazards to trial subjects. They should use IRB reporting requirements to determine if a deviation should be reported or not, and reporting requirements differ from IRB to IRB. So it's important to understand whichever IRB they use, what their requirements are. A lot of IRBs may have documents that explain what needs to be reported, and your coordinators can help you understand where to find that document, where to find these guidelines. Particularly if it's a local IRB, those may not be readily available. So you should always ask for those, and really kind of talk to your coordinators about the various deviations that you're experiencing, and find out what the reporting requirements are. So according to ICH and FDA regarding protocol deviations, principal investigators have certain responsibilities that they should be following. So the investigator should not implement any deviation from or changes of the protocol without agreement by the sponsor and prior review and documented approval from the IRB. You're not going to run into this very often. You're not going to find very many PIs that are going to intentionally deviate from the protocol. They're normally going to follow the protocol. Most of the deviations that you're going to come up with, that you're going to discover, are going to be things that happen sort of in an unforeseen fashion. They're kind of accidental, and that's how the best way to describe those are going to be. But there are responsibilities that PIs have to adhere to, so you need to be familiar with what those responsibilities are. So further, according to ICH and FDA guidelines regarding protocol deviations, the investigator or person designated by the investigator should document and explain any deviation from the approved protocol. So in almost every case, this is going to be someone other than the investigator, because they're more than likely going to be the one that is involved in that process, and more than likely going to be the one that you're talking with about it for the ones that you discover. So under certain circumstances, the investigator may implement a deviation from the protocol in order to eliminate an immediate hazard to trial subjects without prior IRB approval. As soon as possible, the implemented deviation or change, or the reason for it, if appropriate, should be submitted to the IRB, to the sponsor, and to regulatory authorities. You more than likely are not going to run into this very often, but there could be situations where, in the interest of patient safety, an investigator decides to deviate from the protocol in some fashion. So, like I said, you're not going to run into these very often, but it is something you need to be aware of. And in the event that they do that, they do need to submit that to the IRB for approval and also to the sponsor and potentially to regulatory authorities, depending on what that deviation is. So let's discuss the role of sponsors and monitors in the identification and assessment of protocol deviations. So in ICH E6 5.0.4 risk control, detection of deviations from the predefined quality tolerance limits should trigger an evaluation to determine if action is needed. So basically what this means is that if a deviation is severe enough, then that's probably going to be followed by some type of remedial action, some type of follow-up. So it's important that we kind of understand that, and you will run into that every once in a while, when you're out there monitoring. So the sponsor should describe the quality management approach implemented in the trial and summarize the important deviations from the predefined quality tolerance limits and remedial actions taken in the clinical study report. So, what this means is that sponsors are going to come up with some form of guidelines, some form of method to deal with important deviations as they come along, and some kind of prescribed corrective action or response to that. And normally what they'll do is, as they begin to compile all of the deviations, in their CTMS system, for example, they'll identify the ones that are important, and they may require some additional follow-up with the sites and maybe some adjudication back and forth. And then, these are going to be more than likely already, they're going to be summarized, or they may be specifically discussed in the clinical study report. So you need to be aware of that, because you're probably going to be involved in some of those discussions, and getting back in contact with your sites to follow up on deviations. And sometimes these could be deviations that occurred months earlier when they've kind of forgotten about it. That does happen. So kind of be aware of that, and that's something that if you can sort of get a jump on that, it makes things a lot easier. So what you're all waiting for, the monitor's responsibility for protocol deviations. So this is found in ICH E6 5.18.4. And it says the monitor, in accordance with the sponsor's requirements, should ensure that the trial is conducted and documented properly by carrying out the following activities when relevant and necessary to the trial and the trial site. So it includes communicating deviations from the protocol, standard operating procedures, good clinical practice, and the applicable regulatory requirements to the investigator, and making appropriate action designed to prevent recurrence of the detected deviations. So that's important. So preventing deviations is just as important as identifying them and reporting them. So once again, go back to that, what I said earlier in our course about becoming a site manager. So you're helping your site be successful, and you're helping them by limiting the number of deviations that they experience. Also, what you're going to do as a monitor is, in your monitoring report, or your trip report that it's often called, your report should include a summary of what the monitor reviewed and the monitor's statements concerning the significant findings or facts, deviations and deficiencies, conclusions, actions taken or to be taken, and actions recommended to secure compliance. So any deviations that you mention or that you discover while on site, they should be documented in your monitoring report, and you will have a section in your monitoring report for deviations. And these will be deviations that may be associated with a specific subject. Say, for example, they were out of window for a visit. Or it could be something that is specific to the site. Maybe they weren't storing IP properly. something like that. That'd just be one example. That's not necessarily associated with a subject, but it's more of a site level deviation. So you're going to be documenting those in your monitoring report. So I've assigned a couple of readings for this week, and you'll find these on Moodle in the topic page. The first reading is going to be Avoiding Protocol Deviations in Clinical Research. I think you'll find that to be very interesting. The second reading comes from St. Joseph Health Organization, Guidance for Reporting Protocol Deviations. That would be kind of similar to what you would see from an IRB guidance document on what and how to report for deviations. Then you've got violation or deviation. What's the difference? So I think once you read that, you'll kind of have a clearer understanding of what the difference is between the two. And then finally, assessment and classification of protocol deviations. So this will help you begin to categorize what area your deviations that you discover are going to fall in. For your online assignment this week, in this week's discussion forum, you will review and assess several examples of site activities that may or may not be a protocol deviation. Please provide your short assessment for each example in your response. So I'm not looking for a whole lot of detail, but I do want to know, is it a deviation? What type of deviation is it? How would you discuss it with the site, and what kind of corrective action would you take? Example 1. While reviewing the site signature and duty delegation log, you notice that one staff member has been delegated to enter data into the EDC system. However, there is no documentation that the staff member completed EDC training. Is this a deviation? Why or why not? Example 2. While reviewing source data sheets for a subject, you discover that a sub-investigator, an MD, at the site has signed the source data using an ink stamp of his or her signature along with a handwritten date. Is this a deviation? Why or why not? And finally, example 3. Subject WT-101 was dispensed 3 boxes of study drug at visit 3 and asked to return all unused study drug when they returned at visit 4. The subject returned 1 box containing 4 study drug doses, but did not return the other 2. When asked, the subject said that he threw the boxes away as they were empty. Is this a deviation? Why or why not? Post your assessment for each example in this week's discussion forum. You can use one posting for all 3 examples. So I want you to spend some time with this, determine, is it a deviation, is it not a deviation, how would you handle it in discussing it with the site? Would you ask them to report it to the IRB? How would you document it in your trip report? Those types of things. So keep your answers fairly short and straight to the point, but do identify each example in your answer, and I'll look forward to seeing your responses on the discussion forum.